Good evening. This is The Report with me, John Rees. On tonight's programme, we'll be taking a look at why the Ebola crisis in West Africa seems to have no end in sight. We'll also look at Egypt as the trial of Al Jazeera journalist Peter Oborne and his colleagues enters a new phase. But first, former Tory MP Mark Reckless held his seat for UKIP in the Rochester and Strood by-election. This came after a campaign where Prime Minister David Cameron promised the Conservative Party would, I quote, throw the kitchen sink at the campaign. Labour also managed to embarrass itself by sacking their shadow Attorney General, Emily Thornberry, after she tweeted an image of a Rochester house bedecked with St George's Cross flags. Nathaneal Amos-Sansam has this report.
And I declare that Mark John Reckless has been elected as the Member of Parliament for the constituency of Rochester and Strood.
The self-proclaimed People's Army marched to victory last night, as the former Conservative MP Mark Reckless won his seat of Rochester and Strood under the UKIP banner. UKIP had not fielded a candidate against him in 2010, but with a majority of 2,000 votes, the result was not on the same scale as the Clacton by-election held last month. In his victory speech, he said the result proved that voting UKIP could no longer be considered a wasted vote.
This is your victory. As you savour it, think of this. Rochester and Strood was our 271st most winnable seat. If we can win here, we can win across the country. If you vote UKIP, you get UKIP.
The victory comes out of a long and at sometimes bitter campaign, as the Conservative Party pledged to throw the kitchen sink at winning the seat. But in the days running up to polling, Conservative sources declared the seat all but lost. Many say that UKIP is a party that doesn't stand for anything, a charge the party's leader Nigel Farage strongly denies.
But every time UKIP does well, I'm told, oh, it's just a protest vote. It'll disappear next time round. It isn't a protest vote. Go out there now and meet UKIP voters. They were, this wasn't about protest. This was actually a positive vote. They believe in the party. They want to go on voting for the party.
The loss of the Kent seat, once a key battleground in general elections, illustrates a growing disillusionment in the country with established political parties. The campaign also showed that UKIP's opposition to Europe and immigration has resonated with certain parts of the British electorate. But Peter Wilding, director of the pro-EU group British Influence, says that the result in Rochester shows the danger of mainstream parties trying to copy their rhetoric.
Well, the problem with this debate is it is obviously in UKIP's interest to portray everybody who disagrees with them as part of some conspiracy or some establishment. I think anybody from number 10 down to a Conservative Party Member of Parliament must see that out-Nigeling Nigel is never going to work, because Nigel doesn't have to provide answers to these problems. And so by merely following him to the right, you are essentially demonstrating the fallacy of what somebody has said. UKIP is right, don't vote for them. I mean, that's not going to appeal to anybody. So what is absolutely necessary now, and I'm sure your viewers would feel this as well, is that the people are looking to David Cameron, Ed Miliband and Nick Clegg to say that the truth of this problem is that we need immigration for the economy, that there certainly are problems, but to blame it on the immigrants and to blame it on Europe is not the answer.
Last night was also a bad night for Labour, as the party's shadow Attorney General, Emily Thornberry, was forced to resign from the shadow cabinet after tweeting a picture of a house in Rochester, draped in England flags and with a white van outside. UKIP and many parts of the media claimed that it showed metropolitan contempt for certain sections of society, and many analysts claim that UKIP is a significant threat, not just to the Conservatives, but to all political parties. Political scientist Dr. Matthew Goodwin says that UKIP's revolt is one that cuts across party lines.
UKIP now is beginning to make some pretty significant inroads into the Labour Party's vote. It's also winning over a significant number of disaffected Liberal Democrats, and there's some evidence to suggest it's winning over people who didn't vote at all at the last general election. The problem for the main parties is as this revolt gets more momentum, it's beginning to draw in support from different groups in society. It's not just a second home for Conservatives.
All eyes will now turn back to Westminster, where 2 UKIP MPs now sit, to see if any other MPs will now defect to Nigel Farage's party. And as things stand, no party currently seems to have a response to the challenge UKIP is presenting. Nathaneal Amos-Sansam, The Report.
Well, with me to discuss this is Daily Telegraph columnist and political commentator Peter Oborne. Welcome to the programme, Peter. So they're saying this is their 271st least winnable seat, and so they can triumph anywhere. But the truth is, UKIP haven't won a seat where there hasn't been a Tory defection.
That's exactly right, and it's also very important to bear in mind that this is a by-election, and it'll be very different come the general election. I don't think we should get too excited at this stage about what's been going on.
Do you think there's a danger, though, to the sort of general political discourse, if not to the sort of balance of power in Westminster, to be, as one of the commentators in that clip said, out-Nigeling Nigel all the time? I mean, this seems to be something which both Cameron and Miliband are doing.
Well, yes, but I don't agree. I think there is a huge message in this surge for UKIP, and that is that the main political parties have been ignoring their core voters for a very long time. And therefore, it is sensible to listen to what UKIP has to say.
Do you think that, I mean, that's been a long-term trend, though, hasn't it? You know, I mean, you could say almost over the whole post-war period. I mean, the Tories used to have 3 million party members. Labour used to have 1 million party members. Now they're both down below 100,000. I mean, UKIP may be a kind of product of that situation, but it's not necessarily the cause of it.
Absolutely. It's a manifestation of the collapse of democracy in Britain post-World War. But you say post-World War II, but actually it's really in the last 20 years.
Yeah.
We've had, and you can date it exactly to the emergence of the modernisers of Tony Blair in 1994, when they calculated that politics was actually a technical game involving what they called triangulation, when you basically ignored your own supporters and sought to win elections by winning the supporters of the other side. And that led to the collapse of ideological distinctions and the collapse of politics in many ways.
Yeah, because when you look at for instance, the British Social Attitude Survey, this is what politicians think, but it's not what actually the mass of ordinary people think. They still think pretty much in kind of ideological terms, don't they?
Yeah, I don't. I think that the people have strong political views. They want to get engaged with politics, and it's the politicians who've turned their back on ordinary people. That's what's happened, and that is why UKIP, which is such an important phenomenon, and it's worth bearing in mind, it is part of a phenomenon across Europe. You know, it has its parallels everywhere else in Europe. And it is worth bearing in mind, I think, that the European Union is an anti-democratic project, which is based on systematically ignoring the wishes of ordinary voters, and the party political machine and the apparatus of democracy has been captured by this technocratic elite. You can see with Italy, where the last 3 changes of government have been imposed by the IMF and by the international financial system, rather than anything to do with the voters in Italy.
It's an interesting picture, the European one, isn't it, though, because it shows that in some cases this kind of hollowing out of the centre of establishment politics can lead to a kind of populist right-wing variant, but in other places, say in Greece with Syriza, it leads to a kind of popular left-wing variant. So, I mean, but the problem remains with the heart of government, doesn't it?
It does, and I think this is why politicians have to, but British politicians have to listen and look very hard at UKIP. I mean, it is important to bear in mind that UKIP is doesn't make much sense in policy terms. You know, you've got one wing of it which is quite socialist, it's statist, it supports high public spending. That's associated with the economic spokesman Paddy O'Flynn, who's a friend of mine. I should declare an interest. And then there's the Thatcherite wing, which desperately get rid of O'Flynn and wants UKIP to float Britain off into the middle of the Atlantic Ocean and become the 52nd state of the United States. And on immigration, there is 2, Carswell, Douglas Carswell, the ex-Tory MP who defected, is very much, as far as I can tell from his pronouncements, pro-immigration, but actually if you listen to most UKIP supporters, they are anti-immigration. So it is going to collapse at a certain point under the weight of its own contradictions.
Do you think it'll collapse, or do you think it'll just kind of expel one wing or the other and carry on as a more kind of homogeneous organisation?
Well, I think if it does that, then it becomes a fairly irrelevant organisation. At the moment, it is a rebellion of ordinary voters who have been taken for granted by the political establishment, and it is very interesting to see how it will evolve from here. My own view is that it won't win many seats at the next election. It will have a bearing because it will grab votes from other parties. I don't see it winning more than 2 or 3 seats at the coming election. I may be wrong.
Are you worried about what it's doing to the general political discourse? Because if we think back to when, after all, David Cameron, I think 2006 described them as, what was it, fruitcakes, loonies and closet racists. It's hard to imagine him being able to say the same thing now.
Well, I think that it's very important. If it emerges as a racist party, it will then collapse. I think one of the things which UKIP has done is give a voice to disenfranchised voters, which isn't the BNP. And if it starts to, it's so far, if it does discover that there's a racist element in a record in one of its candidates, that man or woman gets expelled. And so if it is possible to say to UKIP, you are racist, then it collapses, in my view. Or at any rate, it then becomes so foul that it won't, rightly, it will not be permitted into public discourse. And I think it's very interesting to see how it's going to evolve in that way, because clearly it does appeal to the ex-BNP types. There's no doubt about that. An element of their voters are ex-BNP. You can't. But that is the vote. As far as I can determine, it's the voters, not the key party figures.
OK, well, thanks, Peter. Peter's going to be back with us later in the programme. But before we go to our first break, let's have a look at what's being said about this story on Twitter. Emily Thornberry, of course, did steal the limelight from UKIP, although not in the way she might have wanted. After 2 calls from Ed Miliband, she tweeted, "I apologise for any offence caused by the 3-flag picture. People should fly the England flag with pride." Not everyone thought she should have resigned. Chief political commentator at the Huffington Post, Mehdi Hassan, called it madness, and he said, "So Lord Freud didn't resign from government over his disabled wages remarks, but Emily Thornberry resigns over a tweeted picture." Well, that's the end of that bit of the programme, but join us after the break when we'll look at the rest of today's news and more of what you've been saying on Twitter.